All right. Welcome everyone to our session today. We'll give everyone a few minutes to get settled. It is 12:58. We will start at 1. For those of those that are joining us early, please feel free to tell us where you're joining from in the chat. We're happy to see you today. We're just like letting everyone get in, get settled. We will have a lot of people with us today. Um, so please tell us where you're joining from in chat. We're letting everyone get a chance to get settled. We will start our presentation at 1. We've got Maryland, Indiana,
Romania?
Secretary of State. They are coming in fast and furious. I can't even keep up with this. Um, I'm seeing lots of Indiana. That's my home state. I'm a Hoosier, so hello, fellow Hoosiers. Um, Alabama, Ukraine. Thank you
Yeah, there
for
was a
joining.
Romania. Yeah, too.
Wow. Um, Romania. Wow. New Jersey, Venezuela, more Indiana. This is great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items and then we'll get to our presentation. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Ed Marketing Manager here at APA. We're so happy to have you join us today for our webinar on motivation in higher education. Everyone is sharing where they're joining us from in the chat. Um, as far as my housekeeping items go, although attendees are muted and their video is off, we have multiple ways to communicate here today. The primary way is via chat. Please use chat to talk to your fellow attendees. Feel free to have conversations, respond to each other. We'd love to see you engaging not only with us, but with your fellow attendees. Auto captioning hasn't been enabled, so if you need captioning, it is available for you via the show captions button at the bottom of Zoom. Um, and Q&A functionality is available. So please use the Q&A window if you have questions for the panel or myself. It's easier to keep track of that way. As we can all see, chat is moving very quickly. Obviously, right now, everyone's sharing where they're from, so it's moving very, very fast. But if you have questions directly for myself or the panel, please use Q&A. As far as the recording, I know we get a lot of questions about this, so we will be sharing the recording with you as soon as it's available, and that will have a chat transcript as well as captioning. So if you feel like you missed something in chat or you missed something during the presentation today, please don't worry, the recording will have it. In addition to the recording, everyone who is in attendance today will be receiving an attendance certificate. You can share that on LinkedIn, add it to your LinkedIn profile, your CV, other social media, email it to your supervisor, anything like that. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And also thank you to our wonderful panel and author team of Motivation Mythbusters for joining us today. We're very excited for this session. Just a brief introduction because they will also introduce themselves later. But today we have Dr. Wendy Grolnick of Clark University, Dr. Benjamin Hetty of University of Oklahoma, and Dr. Frank Worrell of University of California, Berkeley joining us today. So I will turn it over to you all because everyone is here to listen to you, not me. So Wendy, please take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea. I'm going to share the slides and hopefully that'll go okay and everyone will be able to see it. How did that go? All good? Excellent.
All good.
Technology. So thank you so much for coming to our presentation, Motivation Mythbusters, Cracking the Code to Motivating First-Year Students. So when I heard about the topic that people were interested in hearing about motivating first-year students, I got really excited. First-year students bring up a lot of strengths and they also bring enthusiasm, but they also bring challenges and some motivational challenges. And the experience that they have in the first year can really set the trajectory of their motivation. So it's really important to, think about what we can do to make their experiences as motivationally optimal as possible. So, as instructors, some of us are instructors here, and we have the challenge of working with first year students. Not for the faint of heart. There's a lot there, and we are going to hopefully give you some thoughts and some ideas for how you can set things up in a way that's going to be great for you, and as you start your experience. So our goal is to provide some ideas and solutions to common motivational problems. And we're going to do it hopefully in a fun way by linking these issues to myths that people have about motivation. We're going to tell you about these myths, then we're going to tell you about the science that busts these myths. And then we're going to share, importantly, strategies that follow from the science that can be great for boosting students' motivation, for instructors' motivation, and really for anyone's motivation. So while we are focusing to some extent on first-year students, the information that we provide is going to be relevant to all students, because all students have motivational challenges and all instructors have motivational challenges. So it's going to be relevant to everyone, no matter what type of student we're talking about. It's also going to be relevant to students. If you're a student and you're listening to this, we have some great strategies to share with you for making your school year great. So just a little bit about us. I'll tell you a little bit about our story. Ben Frank and I actually met as members of the Coalition for Psychology in Schools and Education. And we were actually literally sitting around and lamenting about how there's so much misinformation out there about motivation. It really gets in the way of optimally motivating ourselves, optimally motivating students. And we kind of had an aha moment. We were like, hey, why don't we put our skills together and write a book about this? So a few years later, we do have Motivation Mythbusters, science-based strategies to boost motivation in yourself and others. And so we put our ideas into this book, and it's filled with strategies that you can use that are much more detailed than what we're able to provide today. And so if you're interested in that, it's available to you. And it's also could be a great text for a class in psychology, a class in motivation. So I'm Wendy Grolnick. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm a professor at Clark University. I've been teaching motivation for about over 30 years, and my own research is on how parents and teachers influence children's motivation. Ben Heady is an educational psychologist and professor at University of Oklahoma. He studies motivation and learning context, and he actually has expertise in changing beliefs and in motivation. And then our third author, Frank Worrell, is a school psychologist by training. He's a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He studies motivation and assessment in the school context with an emphasis on cultural identities. And he has expertise in gifted education and in talent development. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about what motivation is. We use that term all the time. How's your motivation? Can we motivate people? We use it in very different ways. So what motivation is, in our definition, is it's the energy that we direct toward activities. It's not a thing, like a thing is motivated, but it's a process. It's how we direct that energy, and it's constantly changing and moving. Motives are internal processes. So motives are within people. They're the kind of sense of wanting, the sense of energy, the sense of urges that are in people. And so it's kind of interesting when you think about it. If motives are within people, you can't really motivate people. You can't really get in their heads, get in their bodies and motivate them. Now, you can push them or coerce them or persuade them, but that's really different than motivating them. Because when we motivate people, what we're doing is trying to leverage those motives within them. We can set the context that motivation will be most likely, but we can't actually get in there. So it'll come through in the way we talk about things. And underlying motivation are people's needs. We have that energy because we have needs. One need that we have is to be autonomous, to feel like we're kind of the owner of our actions, that we're choiceful, that we're behind what we do. We just don't do very well or feel very good when we feel like we're pushed or coerced or pressured. Another need we have is to feel competent. We want to think that we want to feel like we can succeed, and we just don't feel very good or very motivated when we feel like we can't be successful. And the third need we have is to feel connected or related to those around us, and we just don't feel very good or very motivated when we feel like we're not valued, and people don't care about us. So when we're talking about leveraging motivation, we're talking about kind of setting the conditions that facilitate people meeting these needs, as a start. So, so with that idea about motivation, let's talk a little bit about myths. What are myths about motivation, and why is it so important to bust them? So motivation myths are beliefs that are either totally inconsistent with science or involve an incomplete understanding of how motivation works. And some of the myths that we're going to talk about are more one, and some are more the other. Importantly, holding these beliefs can really undermine motivation in ourselves and others. And understanding the science of motivation is just essential to optimal motivation in ourselves and others. So that's kind of why we're focusing on these myths. So in our book, we have identified 10 myths that really get in our way as people who are trying to motivate ourselves and people who are trying to motivate others. So here's a list of them. We're going to go through them. We identified them by our own experience, by what's in the literature, by what's out there on the internet. There's all kinds of misconceptions out there. And then we kind of checked it out by doing a survey of over 500 people and asking them, do you believe this? Do you agree with this? And pretty much all of these myths are endorsed by a whole lot of people. So we know that they're out there. So one more setting the stage here for what we're going to talk about, because we're going to connect the myths to our notion of motivation. We're going to connect the myths to potential motivational challenges of first-year students. So just a few things that we've identified that will lead us to need to use these optimal motivational strategies. One is that first-year students come in and they're really not clear about the expectations or rules of the game. How do I be successful in a college classroom? They're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, and it's kind of unknown. So that's where a lot of them start. The second thing is they may have been successful without too much effort in the past. Sometimes high schools don't require that much effort to just do well, to do okay. And so it's going to be really different when they enter the college classroom. The other thing that we know is that they make conclusions about ability from very little data. So when they get that first exam and it's not what they thought it should be, they really get dejected and they make conclusions about, maybe I don't belong here, maybe this isn't right. And we have to, that's something, some beliefs that we can tap into about that. The other thing that you might have come in contact with is that students may have had a lot of help with their motivation, or some help with their motivation from without. They may have had parents who reminded them, checked in with them, and there's nobody here in the college classroom to be doing those things. They're going to need to learn how to regulate those themselves in those areas. So that can be a challenge. And the last thing is that they may have been doing well relative to their peers. When we think about how competent we are at things, how well we're doing, we look around us and we compare ourselves to other people. And you might have been in a situation where you're comparing yourself to other people and you're looking pretty good. You get to the college classroom, you're looking around, and everyone looks like they're a little bit more competent than you. Or you don't know how competent they are. There's a phenomenon that many of you may have heard about called the big fish, little pond phenomenon where you compare yourself to others, you find yourself doing well, you feel competent. When you get into a situation where you're comparing yourselves to others that are also very competent, your self-confidence may plummet. So we might find that in first-year students as well. So with that being said, we're going to start talking about the myths and what implications they have in the classroom. We're going to give you some science, and we're going to give you some strategies that follow from these. So we're going to start with the first myth. And the first myth is that some people are motivated and others aren't. So you think about that student in the classroom who's doodling, or the student while you're talking, or the student who is handing in their assignments and they're just like the bare minimum. And you think, oh, or you might think, oh, that's not a very motivated student. What can I do to deal with that? Well, the science is that some people are, that the myth, some people are motivated and others aren't, really isn't scientifically based. The science says that you are motivated and so is everyone else. And we're going to get into what the science is. So why it matters in the classroom. If we think of some students as motivated, other students as not motivated, we may provide less attention to students who we think are unmotivated. We kind of say like, okay, well, she's just not that interested. Let's focus on the students that are more interested. Or we might not give up, and we might sort of push and pressure the students that we think are motivated. And as it turns out, that pressuring and pushing really might backfire. And we talked about how when people feel pressured, it really saps their motivation because it interferes with their need for autonomy. So it does matter. So what we do know from the science is that rather than motivation being a issue of a person, it really varies by domain. You know, people can be very motivated in school, not so motivated in sports, really motivated at work, and so forth. And the context can be really important. We can start with someone who doesn't necessarily have the interest, but if we create a really facilitative environment, we can build that interest, we can build that motivation. Motivation also varies by task. It's when tasks are unrelated to your own goals or interests, you might feel less motivated. So if we stop thinking about motivation as something about a person and think about how can we kind of leverage the motivation that everybody has to have them focus it in the direction that we would like. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this, and I wanted to share this. So if we're thinking about some students as motivated and others as not motivated, and we look around, sometimes we might look at a student and say, oh, that's not a very motivated student. She's really not interested. It turns out John Marshall Reeve did a study some years ago that showed that we're not actually very good at knowing which students are interested or motivated in the first place. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I certainly have. Somebody that I thought, oh, this person's not interested. They're sitting there, they're just doodling. At the end of the class, they're the one that comes up to you and said, this was my favorite class. So I was like, well, who would have thunk? I missed that one. We're not very good at knowing how interested people are actually in the first place. There's lots of reasons that people don't participate and so forth. And we'll get into that too. So what can we do in the classroom? It seems that people aren't sort of engaged. And again, we can ask them about this because we may be wrong. We can try to identify reasons for their lack of motivation. Do they feel pressured and that's interfering? Do they feel incompetent? They feel like they don't know how to do well. Do they feel that they're disconnected from the other students in the classroom? Those kinds of things can give you a lot of information. We can also try to figure out what students' interests are. A lot of times at the beginning of the course, I ask students what their interests are, what they're trying to get out of the course, but also just about them and who they are. And then you can begin to try to tie some of the information into their interests. And the third thing we can do is to convey the meaning and value of the information we're providing for the student's own goals and interests. How is this going to be meaningful to you? How is it going to be relevant to the things that you are trying to do? So we can begin to do that and boost that motivation our way. So a second myth, and this one is more like nuanced rather than totally wrong, and that is that rewards increase motivation. I say it's nuanced because, I mean, we can get people to do things with rewards. If I pay people enough money or if I give them enough incentive, they'll do something. But we talked about the fact that that can persuade people, but it's not going to necessarily motivate them. And the truth is that there are a lot more effective motivators than rewards. So asking ourselves, should we really be stressing that grade? Should we really be stressing rewards? And the answer is there are more effective ways to motivate people. Why it matters in the classroom. When students are focused on grades and rewards, they may really just be doing just enough to get that grade or reward. They're really narrowed in on that outcome, and that leads them to do just enough and no more. We also know that learning will be more superficial if students are learning for the grade. We've done some studies ourselves to show that when students are learning for just for the test, they are less conceptual and they actually dump more information after, like pulling the bathtub plug. And then students will also feel more pressure if these contingencies are stressed, and that will interfere with learning. Students will take less risks when they're focused on that grade and be less creative. So what we know is that rewards, and in the classroom, I think about rewards as the pressure of a grade or extra credit or something like that. Rewards increase motivation in the short term, but they don't sustain motivation in the long term. And, if we think about ourselves as setting these trajectories for the first year students to be lifelong learners, we care about that. Rewards also change students' experiences of why they're doing the activities. So if they're enjoying the information, they're really interested, but they start getting pressured by a grade, they start to think, I feel like they are doing this to get that grade. And it sort of kills the joy. The part of the joy is doing it because we want to, because we're choiceful about it. And rewards also keep students from moving toward a value for the activity and for self-regulation. If they feel like they're doing it for the grade or for the reward, they won't take on the importance of that activity, of the meaning of it in the way we'd like. And as we said, the deep learning and creativity are undermined by rewards because rewards really narrow you. Those grades really narrow you. We'll talk some more about this, but we all have to give grades, but there are ways to give them and ways to position things so that they're not focused on that as much. So what can we do in the classroom? We can understand students' perspectives. Students really feel much more behind what they're doing. They're more engaged when we understand their perspectives, what they're trying to learn, what their barriers are, even on a day-to-day basis, how they're doing. Sometimes there's low energy in the class, and I ask students, what's going on? I feel the low energy. And say, we're really tired. And we're like, I get it. I understand that, today is a day that's rainy and tired, and let's put our heads together on what we can do to boost the energy in our classroom. And so they're heard, then they don't have to sit around thinking, oh, I'm tired and she doesn't know it. They understand where we're coming from. So the other thing we can do to help students to do rather than giving rewards is to give people choices. Choices really help students to feel autonomous. It can be small choices about what topic they are doing on a paper or what deadline they would like to have for a particular assignment, putting our heads together. They can be big choices of how they present their knowledge. So anytime you add choices, it's going to be effective. Making tasks meaningful, again, to students' goals and values. Problem solving together when things don't work. when an exam doesn't go well, rather than sort of pushing and pressuring, sort of saying, let's problem solve together about what happened here and what ideas do you have to make things better. We want to de-emphasize grades when possible. And we can do it in our language to some extent. For example, instead of on my syllabus talking about requirements, I talk about opportunities. I mean, that might sound trivial, I guess. Opportunities to show your knowledge rather than requirements. So we can do things and watch our language in terms of how we present things. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank now to talk about the next myth.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Hope you are learning some stuff and having some fun. So myth 3 is competition always increases motivation. And one can say, who doesn't like a good competition, right? The Olympics just ended. Football season starts on September 5th. And so, but actually, again, like myth 2, this myth, there's a bit more nuance in this myth. And so while we may think that competition always increases motivation, competition can actually be demotivating. So, and so let's talk about how that works, right? This matters for the classroom for several reasons. First, we want students, as Wendy pointed out, to be focused on mastery and learning rather than performance or winning. And so, because if we want deep learning, if we want students, in fact, to remember that knowledge over time, they need to be focused on mastery and learning. Secondly, if your class is seen to be focused on competition, students who are not competitive will be turned off and they will tune out. If I'm the kind of person who's not, I've got to win at any cost, that kind of person, I may actually be turned off. And then finally, we know that cooperation results in better performance than competition. So there's a lot of research on cooperation versus competition. And we know that, in fact, when we do those studies, right, and in fact, these studies go back even to the 70s and 80s, the early self-determination theory studies, that we show that cooperation actually trumps competition. Also, we know that competition is demotivating when it's perceived to be unfair or unequal. For example, we tell a story in the book about when Tiger Woods was in a competition, right? Many golfers who were good but not that good, their performance went down. They didn't think they had a chance of winning. And so they were demotivated when they were competing against somebody they didn't think they could win against. We also know that competition is most demotivating when it's focused on beating someone. So rather than focusing on beating someone, it's actually better to be focused on trying to do your personal best. And finally, we know that individuals and groups differ in their orientation to competition. And so in fact, we have a study going on right now looking at what we call competitive orientations, right? We now know that there are several competitive orientations: self-developmental, focus on personal growth and mastery; hyper-competitive, wanting to win at any cost; anxiety-driven, fear of losing, lack of interest, right? And so these aspects, these orientations of competition are kind of like attitudes that individuals have. And these attitudes that they have are going to, in fact, affect how they're going to respond to competition. So next slide, please. So in our paper on the review, we actually identified 3 competitive types. I just thought I'd throw some data in for you, right? We found a self-developmental orientation. They are high in the self-developmental and low in the other orientations. We found an indifferent one. They're moderately high in indifferent and anxious. And we found an anti-competition group. They don't like competition, they're anxious about it, and they're afraid of losing. And when we look at the data, next slide, please, we can see academic engagement, behavioral engagement, self-efficacy, belonging, having a high work ethic. The self-developmental group is doing better in all of these. And we know all of these are related to engaging in the classroom, to being motivated. Next slide. So what can we do in the classroom? Allow individuals to choose non-competitive activities if possible. So that way, in fact, they're not competing. We can use cooperative rather than competitive scenarios. Put people in groups and have them work together to solve problems, to do projects. We can also have students focus on attaining their personal best. How did you do in the last quiz? And how do you think you can best your score in the next quiz? I had an undergraduate instructor who used to take great fun and pride in saying, you didn't quite get a 10 this time. You got a 9, but maybe you can get a 10 the next time. You know, you can beat your personal best. And so these are things we can do in the classroom with regard to competition. Next slide. I think, Wendy, back to you.
Actually, back to me.
Ben,
So
sorry. Sorry.
myth 4, it's all good. Myth 4 is that motivation is enough for success. So the science says that actually motivation alone is not enough for success. And this is a myth that I see play out all the time in first-year experienced students, because motivation was enough for success in most of their education career, especially high school. They were very motivated, and that was enough for them to succeed and even earn straight A's. Then they get to college, they might have a failure experience. And when they have this failure experience, they don't have the knowledge, skills, and strategies to bounce back from that failure experience. So this matters a lot in the classroom. If we are highly motivated but fail because we don't have strategies to be successful, motivation can plummet. And not having successful strategies can lead to learned helplessness, which is a huge deal, because that's when students stop giving up trying altogether. And lack of self-regulation skills can lead to ineffective studying and low achievement. And when I talked about this very successful high school student, one of their big issues is that they were other regulated, meaning that their parents or their teachers at school were the ones regulating their behavior. And finally, when they get to college, there is nobody to regulate your behavior, and you never built those self-regulation skills. So what can we do about it in the classroom? Our goal is to build this self-regulation skill. And we can do that through a number of different ways. One of those ways is to explicitly teach time management. As I said, high school students never really had to manage their own time. Usually one of the parents was the keeper of their time. And so having an opportunity to explicitly practice time management is key. Teaching students to organize their environment for success is really effective as well. For example, we just ran a research study where we had students think about where they were studying, how loud it was, what the lighting was like, who they were studying with, and then they thought through which of those study environments was useful for them and not when taking tests and completing in-class activities. So thinking about how to organize your environment is a really useful tool as well. And then finally, explicitly teaching students to monitor, evaluate, and modify strategies. And that's really the process of self-regulation. How do you use a strategy? Notice when you're using a strategy, evaluate that strategy for its effectiveness, and then modify strategy. So one of the ways I like to do this in my classroom, even with further students like sophomores, juniors, and seniors, is to have them keep a journal of the way that they're studying for exams or the way that they're completing papers, and think through, after they have taken the exam, how did I study? Was it useful or not? Would I do it again? And if I wouldn't do it again, what would I do differently and why? And so after they complete this reflection, I call it a metacognitive self-regulatory reflection strategy. After they do this, it allows them to practice this strategy of monitoring, evaluating, and modifying their studying approaches.
Thanks. I think I'm up again. And so myth 5, visualizing success will lead to success. I'm seeing that Tesla in my future. So I've wanted a Tesla for quite a time, but visualizing success will not get you there, right? In fact, there are other things that need to be done. What we know and why it matters for the classroom. We actually have research that says that visualizing an outcome can result in students ignoring the work that would be necessary to get to the outcome. Because what happens is when you visualize the outcome, the final thing, you overestimate the likelihood of success, right? And so this then leads to you're feeling good. So you do not necessarily engage in the process of getting to the outcome, right? So if I want to exercise, I can visualize, oh yeah, I run the marathon, but then I don't do the practice that will get me to the marathon. So that visualizing success doesn't get you there. And then if in fact your visualizing doesn't quite go the way you want, if your visualizing results in failure, it can lead you to doubt your ability, right? Oh my gosh, I didn't have this ability to start with. And so, of course, this is a very common thing. And in fact, there are motivational speakers who spend a lot of time telling people the benefits of visualization. Those of you who watch a little bit too much TV, as I've been doing in the last few days, may remember, there's a commercial, the home warranty commercial, home warranty kind of stuff, right? Sort of the mantra. But what can we do in the classroom, right? What we can do is have students focus on the process. So you're not visualizing the outcome, but the process, the steps that will allow you to get to be successful. So if I want to, in fact, get a B+ in this examination, what are my study strategies along the way? How do I actually prep for my paper? How do I do a good paper that's going to allow the professor to give me a grade that will allow me to get then an A, right? So working on those steps. Have students create specific plans. What, where, how to achieve their goals. So for example, even though I teach only doctoral students, when I have my students give me in week 4 a list, a set of plans for their paper. What do you want to write the paper on? And what are the potential subtopics that you're going to deal with? That way they're actually creating the plan for the paper. They can get comments from me on the paper, but they also have started the work of setting out the paper. In the plans, having them create if-then statements, right? If this happens, I can do Y. If in fact there's this problem, I can get around the problem this way, right? And so, and mental contrasting. I'm here now, I want to get to that B+ on the paper, and so therefore, I need to study at least 4 hours a week, right? And so my current state, to get to my future state, I need to do this. And finally, we can teach them to use metacognition. Planning, monitoring, evaluating. What is going on? So is my study strategy effective, right? Math was always my nemesis. And so in my first statistics exam in college, in sophomore year, I got a D because I hated math. And I realized that I could not go through this course and be successful hating math. So I had to get to a neutral place with math. So I actually started I need to not hate math, right? So I got to a neutral place with mathematics. The outcome was that one of my very first publications, my very first year of publication, 1997, was in Education and Psychological Measurement. It was a statistical publication. I would not have predicted that before, but planning, monitoring, evaluating my performance led me there. And so that's an important aspect. And myth 6, I think, is this, Wendy, back to you? Or?
Yeah, that's back to me. Thanks, Frank and Beth. So myth 6, we should wait for motivation to strike. Well, motivation may never strike. It may never be the right time to get started. And so we really should set our goals and get started. So why is it important for students to just get started and do something is that students may procrastinate. They may wait for the optimal time to beginning, and that optimal time might not come, and it is the night before the exam and they start studying. And there are lots of reasons that people procrastinate, but it leads to waiting for that right time where you have enough time, or there's not anything else going on and so forth. That won't do it. So what we, sorry, go back. So what we know is that it's really important to set goals and plans rather than waiting for motivation to strike. And it's consistent with the idea that motivation is not enough. We need to get going. So we know that students who set specific and difficult goals are much more successful than those who don't. So instead of saying, I want to do better in this course, what you want to do is to set a very specific goal about what you're going to do to make that happen. We also know that it's not just having goals that's important, it's the type of goals that students set. We know that students who set mastery goals, what they're going to learn rather than how they're going to do, will be more likely to take on challenges, put in more effort, and sort of bounce back when things don't go as well as they hoped. And when students pursue goals because they're meaningful or they provide enjoyment, they're more likely to be successful than when they set goals just to meet some contingency to get a good grade. Oops. So what we can do is to encourage students to set specific and difficult goals in the classroom. You may have heard of the acronym SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Did I get that right? Yes. And so instead of saying you're going to read, you're going to do, get a better grade, you're going to be more prepared in class, you can basically start saying, I'm going to read 50 pages every night to be prepared for class. Instead of saying, I'd like to have better relationships with my professors, you want to say, I'm going to go to one of the professor's office hours every month. So very specific plans. When you encourage students to set these goals, you want them to focus on mastery. What do they want to learn? What do they want to know, rather than performance goals? How am I going to do? And then we want to encourage students and ourselves. Writing this book, I had to do this for sure. When you're overwhelmed, it's very hard to get started on the big things. It just feels like it's too much. So you just get started in some small way. So writing this book, sometimes when I felt overwhelmed and I couldn't really get myself to write an important chapter, it seemed too overwhelming, I would just work on the references for a little while. I work on it for a little while, and then all of a sudden I was sort of going back and thinking that it would be more fun to do the chapter. So motivation can be generated from action. You got to just get started on some small thing, and then making this plan with the goals, setting that trajectory. Also important to reflect on why you're pursuing the goal and how it connects to the value, to your own values or what you find important. Remembering that you're doing this paper to learn certain things that you came into the classroom wanting to learn, and reflecting back on that, reflecting back on your why, not just on the how.
Okay, and myth number 7 is that people are aware of how good they are at things, when in reality, we need a lot of help assessing our abilities. We are actually awful, for the most part, at assessing our abilities. And this can take a couple of different looks. The first one is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and this is where you believe you're going to be good at something new, and then you try that thing and you realize that it's actually going to have a bit of a learning curve to it. It's going to take a lot of practice, and this can drop your motivation. So underperforming can lower your confidence and motivation. Or it can take another look as well. And this is when you have low confidence going into something new. And this is the one I'm actually most concerned about. This can lead us to not try at all or give up before we even get started. So what we know, overconfidence can undermine relationships and trust from classmates and the instructor. Underconfident students will be less likely to participate in class activities. Underestimating confidence can cause students to attribute success to luck and failure to ability, which can damage motivation and achievement. And what can we do in the classroom to build calibration skills and confidence? Well, first of all, we can have students explicitly reflect on their own competencies. That way, we can avoid this Dunning-Kruger effect. We can see what skills do we currently have, and then what knowledge and skills are we going to have to build? And that way, when you go into something new and you realize that you have a lot to learn, it's not going to take as big of a hit to your motivation as it would have otherwise. Other things you can do are draw on your mastery experience. You've been successful before you got here. You can do this again with the right strategies and effort. But also, we can set up our class in such a way that we start with a really easy assignment. I start all my classes out with something I know every student will be successful on, and that gives them a win, a master experience in this context, in this course, and then I slowly ramp up the challenge. Or we can use grouping and collaboration effectively and have students learn from each other, especially students who have similarities to each other, and they can learn through vicarious experience. And then finally, we can use effective encouragement and feedback. And it's really important to encourage your students, be genuine about it, but move beyond that and say, in what ways specifically do we believe that you can be successful? How can you be successful? What strategies do we know that you can use?
Great. Back to me for myth 8. Myth 8 is that structure decreases motivation. In our sample, in our survey that we did, many people said they weren't sure if structure decreases motivation because it's not quite clear what structure is. So for us, structure is setting up the learning environment so it's clear how to succeed. This includes clear guidelines, clear expectations, clear feedback. And when structure is implemented in that way, structure can actually increase motivation. Why it matters is that when students feel helpless, when they don't understand the guidelines or rules for succeeding, they don't know how to get from here to there. What can I do to be successful in this class? And then students may give up when they don't feel that they have a pathway to success. So what we know is that structure is not the same as being pushy or controlling. Structure is creating these guidelines and rules and expectations that help people to feel competent. And you can do that in a way that has students also feeling choiceful and not pressured. So you're not pitting structure against people feeling free or choiceful. You're putting structure against chaos or not knowing what's going on. So we know that structure, when classrooms have higher structure, students feel more competent. We also know that structure can be conveyed in a way that supports students' feelings of autonomy, that they won't feel controlled if the information about the classroom is given in certain ways. And what we can do in the classroom is provide clear expectations and guidelines about how students can succeed in your class. This is what you need to do to be successful. This is how you can approach the opportunities that are provided in the class, what's in the classroom, what's expected, put it out there. And then we can also, one part of providing structure is providing people feedback so that they know if they're being successful or not. And we talk about, in the book, we talk a lot about change-oriented feedback. It's not, you can give some positive feedback, but instead of giving the negative feedback, change-oriented feedback takes their perspective and gives them some thoughts about how they might think about going about something differently. How you might, in your, could you think about reorienting this so that your reader has a little bit more background? How might you do that rather than saying, this doesn't the reader doesn't know what you're talking about, or this needs more, that this doesn't work. So thinking about this change-oriented feedback on papers and exams and conversations. And the structure will be most effective when you allow input and choice in creating these guidelines and expectations. I actually have, I talk along with my students about when they want the deadlines for papers to be. I put some, there's some, it can't be whenever, but we have some possibilities, and we talk through, what's your schedule? What are all your schedules like? I mean, you can't do this in a very big class, but and what makes sense to you, and how can we agree? How can we negotiate that out? We talk about opening it up for people's opinions and feedback about how things are going, and how we can change those expectations and guidelines to make students feel more successful.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm going to go through these last two very quickly because we have a scenario we want to take you through. So starting with myth 9. Myth 9, telling people they're smart increases motivation. And this one is probably the one that's most known to all of you. This is really the growth mindset myth, right? So that in fact, telling people they're smart can backfire. And because it leads people to think about ability as fixed, right? And so if telling students they're smart encourages themselves to think of ability as fixed, and therefore, when they don't do well, they've lost their ability or they don't have ability in that domain. It also encourages them to compare themselves to others. And there's almost always somebody, unless you're the top person in a field, who's going to be better than you, right? And so both of these strategies are not good. So what we know, in contexts where the work is difficult, it's easy for individuals to develop self-doubt. Claude Steele of Stereotypes, Threat, Fame talks about our sense of competence being much more fragile than we think it is, right? And attribution theory tells us that students who believe that success is due to effort, it's internal and controllable, they are more likely to persist than those who think it's external or uncontrollable, right? Ability or so forth. So what can we do in the classroom? Acknowledge that some of the assignments will be difficult and require a lot of effort. You can talk about that as part of the setup for your class. Normalize mistakes. Mistakes then are an index of engagement and growth. The student who isn't trying is probably not going to make as many mistakes. Have students, again, focused on the process of the task rather than the outcome. And you'll notice that this is a theme. This idea of focusing on process is a theme that's running through motivation. And finally, you can praise effort instead of ability, right? So praise effort so the students, in fact, are working towards something rather than trying to be smart about it. And the final myth we think is a really important one as well. And this is motivation is determined mostly by individual characteristics, right? Now, as we said, motivation is internal, but it's an internal process, not a trait, right? So we know that structural inequities, can derail that process, right? So why it matters for college students. But students who feel the system is stacked against them will not be motivated to try. Secondly, students who are underrepresented in fields, women in computer science, people who are first generation students, their parents haven't gone to college, they are likely to be sensitive to real and perceived barriers. And so that could derail their motivation. And the students who are most likely to be affected by structural inequities are those ones who I've just mentioned, right? The ones who are not seeing themselves in the other students in the classroom or in the college setting. So what we know, there are several pathways through this works. Structural inequities would lead to perceived structural barriers. The teacher gives you a look that you then interpret, which leads to lower motivation. There's another pathway, right? The structural inequities lead to group stereotypes. If you are African American and you believe the stereotype that Blacks are less intelligent, and you are one or the only Black in a classroom or one of few, you may develop stereotype threat, which lowers your motivation. And then there's another pathway, which actually is coming from the teacher pathway 3, where the group stereotype is leading to low expectations on the part of the teacher, who then teaches you differently, and then you have low motivation. So what can we do in the classroom with that? Develop clear expectations and transparent policies for grading, making these explicit to students. Soliciting regular feedback from students and sharing the results and actions. I always do a mid-course feedback form in my classes, even in all my classes. And then I go over the feedback with the students and say what we can do in response and what we can't do, right? And actively work to enhance belonging and engagement from students from all subgroups in your classroom. And if you can't do it in the major readings, again, I typically have supplemental readings for LGBTQ students and things that speak to different constituencies in the classroom that other people can go to as supplemental readings where they see themselves in the material. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ben. I know we're running out of time. We can get through one of the scenarios.
Yeah, and I think we can move through both of them pretty quickly. So one of the really useful tools in our book is that we created a motivation flowchart or decision tree that when you or somebody you know are struggling with motivation, you can ask yourself or someone else these questions, and then based on your response, you'll move through these different options. At the bottom will be boxes of different motivational strategies that you can use to increase your own or other people's motivation. So we created a couple scenarios for you so you could think about some first-year experienced students and some struggles that they're having with motivation and how they would move through this flowchart or decision tree. So first we have the unmotivated valedictorian, which is Emma. She was the valedictorian of her high school class. She always passed her classes with flying colors. When she got into college, she struggled with her classes. She even failed her first math exam. She couldn't figure out why she was struggling. She was doing the same thing she did in high school. Why wasn't it working in college? Failing really crushed her confidence. Now she's starting to skip classes. She's starting to feel like maybe college just isn't her thing. So let's use this flowchart to answer questions to help Emma solve her motivation issue. First of all, you could start at the top. Are you feeling energized? Emma says no, she's not going to class anymore. She's starting to wonder if college isn't for her. So the next question is, are you feeling competent? The answer again is no. So that brings us to the bottom. We have some options for Emma so she can address her motivation. She can engage in thinking about her success experiences, use modeling. We can use persuasion and feedback, focus on her attributions, or focus on how our class is structured. So let's use one more chart. And that is Michael. So Michael is having some struggles getting across the finish line. Michael is really excited about college. He feels very motivated for his courses. He showed up to all of his class sessions. However, he is struggling to finish and submit his assignments. Michael is afraid that he's going to fail because he has difficulty finishing what he starts. So let's look at the flow chart again. Here, is Michael feeling energized? Yes, he's going to all his classes. Is he getting started? Yes. However, is he maintaining his motivation? The answer is no, which brings us to this box at the bottom of strategies that he can use. They're those self-regulation skills, monitoring, self-control, time management, self-evaluation. And this is a set of strategies that you or Michael could use to improve his motivation. So thank you very much. We appreciate your attention today and listening to us talk about these ideas and our book. We have a QR code on this last slide if you'd like to scan it, and an exclusive discount, not just for APA members. If you use this discount, capital APA, and then the number 15, you will get a 15% discount on this book. And we think it could be really useful for you as an instructor, but a really useful tool in your classroom to use as a guide for your students as well. Thank you very much. And I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, just a couple minutes. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Thank you to everyone for a great conversation in the chat as things were going. Just as a reminder, I will be sending the recording with the chat as well as a transcript, and we'll get you a PDF of the slides as well. So I think we have time for one question, so I better make it a good one. gosh. Okay, sorry. This has been a popular one. It was a popular one at convention. There was a speaker on the imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome. So, what advice would you give to first-year students struggling with imposter syndrome who may feel like they don't belong?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Comes up with my students all the time, and I point out to them that I often feel that way. Sometimes, even at this stage, I've been president of APA, and sometimes I still feel the imposter syndrome. And that because that in some sense, right, if you think about it, a sense of belonging is something that, in fact, the environment does, but you contribute as well. So that if you engage, you actually will find that, in fact, that goes away. So I shouldn't be here. But if I actually engage, go to my office hours, right? Talk to the professors, read my materials and stuff, discover, be engaged, my imposter syndrome will go away. Ben and Wendy may have additional comments on that.
Sure, yeah. I think it connects to some of the things we were talking about the sort of big fish, little pond phenomenon that when you compare yourself to the very competent people around you, you might find yourself lacking. I think sharing. I love Frank's idea of sharing that we all feel that way sometimes, and realizing that the things that you've done to be successful up to now are the things that you can do to be successful from here on in. There's no fixed level of smartness that you bring in. You bring in strategies and effort and interest, and those are going to take you where you want to go.
Thank you so much. We are at 2 o'clock. I want to thank Frank, Wendy, and Ben for being here today. That was a wonderful presentation. I think everyone got a lot out of it. We had a lot of questions about the recording and resources. So I promise we will be sharing those. And just thank you to everyone for attending today and being so engaged and asking great questions. We hope to see you again soon at another session. So just keep your eyes and ears out. We'll be doing these all semester. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.